Hi and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week we are talking all about childhood trauma and the emotional baggage that this creates. Now, if you've experienced any kind of emotional trauma or challenge or upset in your early years, this can have a lasting legacy right into adulthood. It can affect how you think, feel, and act in all aspects of your life. Well, in this teaching, we're going to be focusing on your inner child and how your inner child holds on to this emotional baggage and what you can do to release it. Okay, David, so this topic is something that came up very recently in one of our Golden Thread process workshops, and it's such an important issue, this concept of childhood trauma and the legacy of it. So, as a starting point, many people argue that our emotional experiences and traumas from childhood are somehow stored within us or stored within our body. What's the kind of Wu Wei wisdom take on that?
Well, it was a good discussion because it allowed me to pass on teachings which I think are very important and touch on some of the core teachings of the Wu Wei wisdom model. So the things that's stored is the memory in your memory system. So you relive that same occurrence. You won't let go of that image, that thought, that belief. That's the thing that's stuck. And so that part of your mind that we call the inner child, so here's a fundamental part of Wu Wei wisdom teaching, that part of your mind that we're giving the label the inner child. You may prefer the label subconscious mind or ego, but I think you'll see in this video why I prefer the name inner child. That part of your mind kind of hangs on to that trauma and it doesn't want to let go. And then you create the subsequent, what we call red light feelings. You may call them different names, anxiety, depression, whatever you want to call them. I call them red light feelings. But the hanging on, the holding on, is in that part of the mind that we call the inner child.
So we have the experience in childhood, which can
Terrible
be
experience.
extremely emotionally traumatic. So
Yes.
we're not talking about the storing of a kind of physical damage or physical trauma. We're focusing on emotional issues here and emotional trauma. So we experience this overwhelmingly awful incident or series of incidents when we're young. And what you're saying is, from that point onwards, we can hold on to the memory of that experience, and it also affects what we believe about ourselves and the world around us, and therefore how we interpret life from that point onwards. But the emotions that we experience in that moment, they're not the things that are necessarily held. It's more about the memory and the beliefs associated with the experience.
Well, you've mentioned two or three very important kind of stops along that road line there. So the first thing is, yes, this happens in childhood. In my experience, normally between the age of 6 and 9 years old. And when you were that age, you encountered this traumatic event. And what happened there is you could not process it. You did not have the cognitive understanding to be able to deal with it. It was above your pay grade. And so that created, in that instance, a tremendous, a tsunami of an emotion, very powerful. And nobody can ever explain how powerful and how disruptive these emotions are. Now, at that age, no one's ever taught you or you consider that you may be creating the emotion. So let me just stop now. We are not saying you created or anything to do with the event. We are saying the emotion that you experienced, you are creating that. And so when you're that age, now you're faced with this dilemma. really big dilemma that you do not want to experience or go anywhere near this emotion again. So you set up a kind of a memory resistance to it. Some people say they sweep it under the carpet. Some people say they put it in a box. Some people say they lock it away. Some people say they leave it alone. But what they actually do is put it on what I call the carousel of despair. And this memory incident keeps on coming back like it is ingrained in your memory banks. And it keeps on coming back because you've never resolved the issue. And I would say when I'm speaking to my clients, this is one of the most important things that we do with a golden thread, is to start with the emotion and go down and then try and find and address the issue that they've been holding away. Many of my clients will say, don't go there, leave it alone. But I would say we have to go there and it has to be resolved to you. You have to resolve that incident, that occurrence. You have to find a resolution to that.
And before we move on the discussion, David, I know there's a couple of points you made that we often get queried on. The incidents occurring between, say, typically the ages of 6 and 9, that's only rough guidance. It could be younger and it could be older. But in your experience of working with clients, that is typically the age gap where we have, as you say, like a memory imprint, and then beliefs are created in terms of what's happening here, what's happening with me, who am I, why is this happening? That's the point at which we're perhaps old enough to start trying to piece the jigsaw together, but we don't necessarily do it in a good way or an appropriate way because we're so young. We don't know any better.
It's very important you make that point, Alex, because you're absolutely right. And I'm not being absolutely dead certain and specific to say it has to be between the ages of 6 and 9 years old. But that age gap seems to be very important to me because I think that's the age gap where your emotions, your emotional responses are fully developed, but your cognitive reasoning haven't. So you meet these circumstances or set of circumstances, you can't deal with them. The emotions are very strong. You do not know, you believe the emotions are coming externally, like a lightning strike coming in at you from the outside, from that person, from that situation. And then you defend yourself. You defend yourself by trying to put it away, by affecting your belief system. Many of my clients will become what I call the victim. And I dislike that word so much. And what happens, as you said, then this belief becomes their identity. And there's the problem. And that then is almost kind of etched in stone. It's a filter. And then from then on, they view everything through that filter.
Before we dig into that a little bit deeper, the other thing I wanted to pick you up on, and this is so important, you said that when we are young and we have these experiences, we don't realize that although we're not the one causing the event, we're not the one who's the person who might be acting inappropriately towards us.
Nor are we responsible.
But we are creating the emotions. Now, the point I want to pick you up on is that those emotions that we experience in that moment as a child, would you say they are entirely appropriate and natural response to the situation, to the traumatic or challenging or really difficult thing that's happening to us?
Great question, Alex. And this is very important on the inner child work. Yes, they are totally appropriate for a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old child to react in that way and create those emotions from the mindset and the belief structure that they have is 100% totally appropriate and correct. There is no doubt about that. They had no other way to deal with it. They were looking into an abyss. They looking at, say, their parents and looking at them that they're the ones that should be nurturing and caring and looking after them, and they might be the one that's dysfunctional or abusing them. So there is no fault lying here. The Wu Wei wisdom, the golden thread, the inner child work is all about understanding. I say to you on all these videos, you cannot change what you don't understand. So this work is about understanding and viewing it not from the viewpoint of the inner child, but widening that viewpoint. Because inside of your mind, you have this little child that's struggling, that no one's been able to sit down with them, like we show you in the reparenting videos and all of our inner child work, and to be able to talk you through and widen your perception so you can view things in a wider view. Many of my clients will say things like, well, they're my parents. Aren't parents always right? Very basic misunderstandings. As an adult and as a parent ourselves, we know we're not always right. But when you view it through the lens and through the glasses of a 6, 7, 8-year-old, then parents are these kind of people that you need. You are codependent on these parents. But that doesn't mean to say they're always right or what they say is true. And this is what I say to a lot of my clients. It's very subtle, but very important. You can still love your parents, but you don't always have to agree with them. Can I repeat that for you? You can love and respect your parents, but you don't always have to agree with what they say. And that's very important to heal your inner child, to release that part of your mind that's locked in these very kind of stubborn way of thinking.
Because if we don't do what you've suggested, and we can look into this in more detail now, but before we move on, if you don't do that and we hold on to the memory and we create the belief that the problem doesn't lie with them, the problem is me, and we hold on to that belief and we carry that belief with us into adulthood, that belief then will put us on the carousel, as you said, and that is the belief that will create the emotions. So when some people say, well, these emotions, I've had them from childhood, it's been stored within me from childhood, these emotions, actually what's probably going on is the belief has been carried or stored from childhood, but the emotions are being recreated in every single moment we revisit that belief, or that we allow that belief to be triggered or kind of rattled or scratched in, whether it's our adult relationships, our adult career, dealing with family matters, dealing with friends. It's the belief that is at the root of the problem, not the emotions.
Yes, and that's the Wu Wei teaching, because most of my clients will use terms like, I've got emotional baggage, and they describe things like they got 2 big full suitcases of emotions and they're dragging them around as all of their lives. And nothing can be far further from the truth, because the teaching that I repeat on every video, you are the creator. You are the creator of your emotions. You are not the victim of them. So you're not bringing the emotions from your childhood. You're bringing that thought pattern, that belief, that paradigm, that way of viewing life. And so when you meet life lessons and situations and difficult people, instead of viewing them appropriately from this wonderful, mature, spiritual person that you are, you view them from the viewpoint of a 6, 7, 8-year-old child that is in victim mode and defensive mode and avoiding and people pleasing and trying to make everybody right and taking responsibility for everybody and trying to make the situation right and worrying about what other people think and worrying about their emotions and believe that you create their emotions. This is another point that we talked about, didn't we? So many of my clients strongly believe that they are the creator of their parents' emotions. That if they were better, if they were happy, if they were clever at school, if they were better looking, if they did better, then their parents would not be so angry, depressed, sad. And so the child takes on so much of this heavy thinking, which then affects the emotion. And this is what we're trying to change when we do these videos. You've got to look at this inner child work. It's very powerful. I would say it's life-changing when you can change your perception and when you can see that that part of your mind, remember, it's your mind. It's not separate from you. What we had several times when we was doing the coaching on the weekend, where people saying, well, I don't believe this, but my inner child believes this. But the inner child is only a label for your mind. So you believe this. And this is what we're talking about. Owning it, taking responsibility. Is this true? Am I responsible for my parents' emotions? Were I ever responsible for my parents' emotions? How can a child be responsible for their parents' emotions? How can a child be responsible for anything? They're codependent. They're quick enough to say, yes, I'm codependent. Then how can they be responsible?
And that's the vital life lesson here, because the default, I know for so many of your clients who have experienced this childhood emotional trauma, is to blame themselves, is to put the responsibility for what happened on themselves. And I think what makes the situation even worse is it's not just a case of carrying the beliefs as the baggage from the childhood experience, but our inner child actively seeks to reinforce and make this baggage even more weighty, even more substantial, even more real, almost like to prove a point.
Exactly. I see it all the time. You know how many times I've said, give me the evidence. We talked about not being good enough. Give me the evidence that you're not good enough. And not one person could give me the evidence. They could give me the result and the outcome of believing they're not good enough, but not the evidence. And so this is what happens. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you call it a confirmation bias. So when you have a belief you're not good enough, then you disregard all of the other stuff that proves how amazing you are, how wonderful you are, what I call how awesome you are. That goes over you. That's like water off a duck's back. You focus on those people, incidences, occurrences that proves that you're not good enough. And then, as Alex says, you hold on to them like, oh, I've got it, and you carry them along with you. I call it like the badge of honor. You gladly display all of the things that have gone wrong, and they say, well, there's the evidence I'm not good enough, or there's the evidence I can't cope, or there's the evidence I'm unlovable. And it's not at all. No evidence at all. You've got to go back to where it started. Why did you believe? I can't say this for everybody who's watching this, because we have so many wonderful supporters now. But the evidence that I find when I'm working with clients, it's not even that someone has said it to you. It's what you've inferred. It's what you've gathered by their actions, by the way they reacted, by what you think they should have done. And what I find in the many times is what we're talking about is parents with very poor parenting techniques. And so therefore, you are the recipient of very poor parenting techniques. But that doesn't prove that you're not good enough. In fact, to me, that proves you're pretty awesome to be able to come through that childhood and still survive and still cope and still get on with it. This is, to me, is how awesome you are. I can't understand it, why you view it through that negative lens. And I'm looking at it and saying, I can't see it. Can you prove it to me? Can you please prove it to me? And not one person can prove it.
So if the inner child's tendency is to look for and gather evidence as it sees it to support its belief that the problem lies with you, you're not good enough, you can't cope, you're unlovable. These are the beliefs it's carried from the childhood traumatic experiences. And it kind of files away every time it perceives someone's rejected it, someone's been critical of it, someone's judged it. and it stores that in these like emotional baggage storage that it's carrying around. It's a very perverse thing to do. It's a very self-harming thing to do. But the reason why would the inner child do that?
Well, this is the interesting thing. It's perverse to an adult, or it's perverse when you look at it. But for a child, it makes perfect sense. There's a benefit. And I know you dislike when I say that. If you hold a negative belief, an untrue belief, what I call a lie, like I'm not good enough, there is a perceived benefit for that part of your mind that I call the inner child. I'll give you a couple. As one of the benefits is, if I create the worst case scenario, if I'm really hard on myself, if I punish myself, if I don't expect nothing, and then when the negative things happen, I'm better prepared, aren't I? No, that's wrong. What that does, you're more likely for negative things to happen. So the inner child will always look at the worst case scenario. Always look at it, sees it, and this is what I hear. Oh my goodness, I wish I had $1 for every time a client says this. When I ask them why they do it, and they go, well, it's emotional protection. There's no such thing as emotional protection. How can you be safe from emotions that only you create? It's perverse, it's nonsensical. But the child, that's why in the child's story, they cannot accept that they create their emotions. So that's one benefit. Let me give you, I've got plenty. Let me give you another one. The inner child believes that if people see them in victim mode, if they keep their head down, if they people please, if they're Miss Helpful, Mrs. Helpful, Mr. Helpful, then they'll leave them alone. They won't be bothered, and they're less likely to address any confrontation or conflict or difficult situations. They can duck and dive. And for a lot of my clients, I call it tap dancing. You know that child's game whack-a-mole? You can't pin them down. They're so good at jumping around the place. They won't actually tell you what they believe. And once they do tell you what they believe, as you say, well, okay, let's go into that. Ask them one question, they've gone on to something else, and they've gone on to something else. So the inner child is a very powerful part of your mind that you have to deconstruct. You have to understand what's going on, because we're not here to try and bully the child or to shut the child up or to throw them into a corner and ignore them, because that's what you've been doing all of your life. And here's something else I want to say that came across very strongly as on the workshop. You know, for a lot of my clients, they've had terrible childhoods from dysfunctional parents. But you end up being even worse to yourself. You treat yourself even worse than you've ever been treated. And that's what we've got to stop. And that's the reason why we do these videos. And when I say stop it, I'm not talking to the inner child. I'm talking to the grown up. You know better. Stop it. You've got to listen to the child. You've got to educate the child. You've got to bring the child out of that dark corner. You've got to put your arms around them. You've got to bring them into your heart. You've got to show them love and understanding. You've got to answer their questions. You've got to be their guardian. As I often say, you are their spiritual parent. They're your spiritual child, and they need your help and your guidance and your understanding. And that's what will make the change much more quickly than talking about being a victim, about carrying these suitcases of baggage of emotions around with you and telling yourself lies such as you're not good enough and you can't cope and you're unlovable or you're not worthy or you don't deserve it, or all of this stuff. This is what has to stop. And you have to base your life on truth, honesty, and integrity. And as I said on Sunday, many, many times, would you say to your physical child what you say to yourself? And not one of the people there says, yes, I would. They laughed. They said, of course I wouldn't. That would be ridiculous. That'd be child abuse. But you say it to yourself, and that's what we've got to stop.
And so with this reparenting that you've talked about, we've done so many more teachings that I can put links to in the show notes of this, and also so many more teachings on childhood trauma and exploring that in more detail. But the essence of what you're saying in terms of the work that needs to be done with our inner child, because it's the inner child that's carrying the legacy of this childhood trauma in its beliefs. I think I've picked up there's two main things. There's teaching the child to understand that it is creating the emotions. The original incident is not creating the emotions now. It is creating the emotions because of its beliefs and its thoughts. And then the second thing to work through with your inner child is this point about going back to the original incidences and exploring those and looking for the evidence, re-examining the evidence, re-examining the conclusion that you came to as a child, that it was your fault, that you are responsible for what happened, that it was because you weren't good enough, because you weren't lovable, because you couldn't cope. And actually teaching the inner child, actually, darling, none of this was your fault.
Absolutely. It's such powerful work, as you saw on the workshop. Our clients are brought to tears because it's the first time that they've ever really sat down with that part of their mind and treated it like a 6-7-year-old child and talked to it in that way and communicated. And everything you've said there is very important. Can I just add one more thing that's very important? Listening to the child. Actively listening and answering the child's questions. So many of my clients, they're very good at telling the child what it should be doing, what it shouldn't be doing. They don't educate the child. They don't listen and answer the questions. And when I work with clients, that's where I think I get the most progression very quickly, is when I try and get my clients, if they can, not all of them can, of course, but to almost kind of what you would call it, channel the child, channel that part of their mind. And so I just ask them, it's very simple, drop your shoulders, take a breath, close your eyes if you want to, and I'll just ask you a question and just answer the first thing that comes into your mind. You can retract it, you can take it back, it doesn't matter. And I always, when I'm speaking to the inner child, and I would recommend when you do your work, is call it a little pet name like sweetheart or little one or son. And I would say, okay, son, so what is your thinking on this? And then after you've done that a couple of times, you see that part of your mind, he just wants to talk, just wants to share. And he just wants somebody to listen and to give it something, an answer that it can consider. He may reject it. We may go into a conversation. But that's the key to the inner child work. After you've done the golden thread, which is very important, that's when you get through all the emotions, you get through all the lies, you get through all the stuff, the kind of the fog and the confusion, and you get to the inner child, and then you can sit down with your inner child and start talking to them and educating them. And from a Taoist point of view, what that does is bring you together. So there's no separation. There's no internal fight or struggle. There's none of this punishing yourself and torturing yourself like a lot of my clients does. You come together in a oneness and a love where you can then move forward and reach your true potential, because I believe you are awesome. No doubt. Not perfect, but awesome.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Well, if you're interested in doing this golden thread process work with David one-to-one, I will put a link to learn more about David's sessions and consultations in the show notes. I will also put a link to learn more about our online workshops where we teach the golden thread process and the inner child work techniques that we've just talked about. If you have enjoyed the teaching, please do let us know and share it with someone else who you think may also benefit. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new teachings every week, and we would love to share your journey with you. Bye-bye.